So yes, we have Ed and Georgia here today from Ernst & Young Intuitive, who are going to be presenting some of their insights and case studies about UX research in the Agile development cycle. I will hand this over to them and let them share some of their advice with everybody here today.
Hey everybody, this is Georgia Spangenberg.
This is Ed Herzog.
And we're going to be talking to you obviously about UX research within Agile development sprints. So a little background about us. I'm a UX researcher at Intuitive. We're a kind of small boutique design development research studio in Philadelphia, and we were acquired by Ernst & Young a little over a year ago.
And I am a senior UX engineer here. I've done a lot of different things in technology, from networking to back-end coding, .NET, PHP platforms, all that sort of stuff. Currently doing a lot of work with UI and UX over the past several years. I write a lot of front-end code, and I have a lot of interest in research topics in the field of UX.
So just to level set on what we're going to be talking about. So initially, we'll talk about how to run research on tight timelines, so within sprints pretty much, how to plan research while you're in those sprints and while design is moving and even development. And then finally, a little bit about the future and how we see object-oriented UX improving the Agile process. And when we talk about Agile, we're talking about it from our own frame of reference. So we just wanted to be a little bit clear about that and set your expectations about what we do here at Intuitive. So our projects or our work is mostly project-based. So we're working on smaller things like websites, apps, and experiences that range anywhere from several weeks to several months, but it's typically not an in-house product software development type of model. So that's what we mean when we talk about Agile. It's our kind of our own way of doing Agile here at Intuitive. Yeah. We're going to be talking about UX research in context of the past, the present, and then the future. So we'll start with the past. And
usually it's the traditional process that I've encountered is pretty linear and atomized. I started working specifically in the field of user-centered design going about eight years ago now. Like I said, before that, I'd done other things with back-end development and networking. So I really started getting involved in the process about 8 years ago, started to observe how it all worked. And there was different patterns that I noticed would evolve, different pain points, different things that would go wrong in a process. It was very typical that you would have a research process in the beginning, and that would just consist of researchers, and they would deal with the client. They would do work, they would do their work, it would get passed off to design, and then often design was really, what we had sold ourselves as digital designers. And often iterations would go much longer than had been anticipated or planned. And usually the idea is we wanted to give the best product possible. So if something took 50% longer than anticipated or twice as long, that's just how it was. And of course, this impacted development. We did the implementation. So obviously, if design expanded way beyond what the original timeline was, we had to eat a lot of that. So that meant a lot of 12-hour days, that type of thing. It also meant cutting corners. We didn't really necessarily get to write the software, the code, the way that we really wanted to. It meant a lot of times that testing could be pretty dicey because of those corner cutting. And I started to look for patterns. We had these recurring problems. I wanted to discover why. It wasn't the process. I believed in user-centered design and the abstraction, in the ISO standard, how it's written. Of course, with some exceptions, but I thought it was all a really great foundation of what we were doing, and the people were great. But I felt like that there was just something wrong with the process itself, and then it was linear and atomized, and each one of these different disciplines existed within their own silo. There just wasn't enough collaboration.
So some deficits with the traditional process, and a lot of us think of this as waterfall, is from a research point of view, it puts the focus on the user really in the upfront phase of research often. So we might be doing some discovery in the initial stages, but the user is not the focus when we move into something like design and development. Also, because it's early and conceptual, it's very abstract. So it's ideas that are kind of passed along to design and development that might not be as tactical as needed for them to be able to act on those ideas. And then the biggest thing is that research is often deprioritized because it's seen as something that's not critical to delivery of the product. So we're not handing off a design, we're not actually building whatever it is we need to build. So it's something to stand in the way of us achieving our timeline and delivering on time. From a design point of view, similarly, we're focusing on interaction and interactive elements rather than being more conceptual. So there's kind of a misconception of what abstract could mean for design versus what it means coming from research. Atomize focus on interaction before data. So similarly, like we talked about from a research point of view, the developers need a certain set of information to get started, and they're not really getting that kind of information because designers are focused on something else. And then, of course, the voice of the user is lost at this point in the process.
Of course, there's some implementation deficits. I spoke a bit about the timeline crunch and how a lot of the responsibility fell upon the implementers when it came to making up for time that had gotten overextended. But there are also other deficits, such as developers would see very little interest in the research phase. So things that they should have been paying attention to early on, they were either not invited to the meetings because of that silo sort of mindset, or they just didn't really pay a whole lot of attention, to be completely honest, because they didn't really see how the research was necessarily relevant. And there was also this whisper down the lane problem where focus on the user was lost because information that was gleaned in the research phase would kind of get changed and altered when it got to design, and then when it got from design onto implementers, things just kind of got lost along the way. Different issues would come up. They were often tough to rectify late in the process, things that we should have caught early on if we had been a lot more collaborative. So I got thinking about, what is this process really like? I like to think about things in terms of models, in abstractions. What does it really resemble to me? And I started to think that, this whole thing sort of looked like a procedural design, and it's like procedural programming. It was one step after the other. But the thing is, I existed in a world of object-oriented programming, and I felt like with object-oriented programming, you'd have a lot higher degrees of collaboration, a lot more speed, reusability, all the benefits, all the reasons why we operate according to that paradigm in the world of programming today rather than procedural. But the design process seemed very procedural. And I started to think about, could we move beyond that? What can we do differently to speed things up and to make things a lot more collaborative? So we're going to talk a little bit about how have we moved beyond that. We're going to talk a bit about the present and what we've done to rectify some of those problems we've seen in user-centered design in the past.
So the idea is a shift in mindset, and this is just simply that we're integrating research within design and development sprints. It's still agile, but we're incorporating and collaborating all disciplines and all deliverables in that sprint timeline, if you will. And when we say a shift in mindset, we mean from a research point of view that, again, research is engaged throughout the project, not just in the upfront or in the very end for usability testing to validate designs. And all disciplines use sprints to deliver value. So when we do a sprint review at the end of the sprint, research is there at those meetings and at the table, and also sharing whatever they were working on and completed throughout that sprint. Research is a design and development tool for creating a user-centered product. And the point there is that it's not simply to do research or selling a research project on its own. It's a tool for something else. So if we kind of shift our mindset to that, it helps us understand what our role is in the project. And finally, abandoning that assembly line process in the way that research doesn't have to impact the timeline. It doesn't have to push back design and development because it's something that we do and then we hand off and the handoff continues. So framing it from a user story perspective, I hope you're familiar with user stories since we're talking a little bit about Agile. as a researcher, I want to get to findings and insights quickly so that we can get to a good design quickly. So the goal is user-centered design. It's not for the sake of doing research or creating some kind of detailed report that someone may or may not read and likely just kind of goes in the trash. So who should be involved in research throughout the sprints? Typically here we include all three disciplines as well as clients, and we do different kinds of research. So we're either informing design and development or evaluating, depending on what the need is at any point during a project. And then when, as often as it's needed throughout the sprint. So we're allocated to a project. It doesn't mean that we're dedicated 100% of our time, but if something comes up on that project and there's a need to get some insights, that's when we're pulled in and participate. So what does it look like? We have this idea called the Agile Trinity, and it's just a representation of all three disciplines collaborating throughout the project and process for that one goal, which is delivery of whatever it is that we're doing.
And instead of having that product get passed from one silo to the next in a straight line, we think about it as being at the center. It is user-centered design, and we think about it conceptually and visually that way.
Another way that we represent it is just showing that within each sprint, each discipline has a role, and it may be a bigger role, 100% of their time, or it may be 10, 20, 30% of their time, but they are all engaged throughout the project and throughout the sprint cycle so that we know when we're needed and when we can contribute and provide value. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a particular project that we worked on, just to demonstrate an example of how we implement what we call rapid agile research within a sprint-based project. So for this particular project, it was a website redesign for financial advisors, and we were just asked to create a new look and feel as well as experience for the new brand. There's a lot of content that lived behind login that they wanted to bring up front. In terms of timeline, it was 6 months, which equated to 8 sprints for us because we typically work in 3-week sprints. And then at the end of this project, we delivered a working prototype with reusable code. So in the beginning of a project, and this one in particular that we're looking at, we create a sprint roadmap. So the idea here is that we don't know exactly what we're going to be designing and developing at this point because we haven't done all of the research and discovery and established the vision yet, but we have an idea of what the goals are for the project from the initial stakeholder interviews that we might have done from the kickoff and from the approach or scope of work. So we have an idea of the kinds of things we're going to be looking at, like doing some upfront research to understand what the experience is today, what kind of themes we might want to identify for the future state of this experience, starting to build out a framework for whatever that is, some detailed design of the different experiences on this website in this example, refactoring as we gather insights and iterate on that particular design, and then finally more detailed workflows. But the important thing here is that you can see research is incorporated in every one of these sprints. And you can get a rough idea of what you're going to be working on. So you know that in the beginning, we might want to do some interviews, for example, and competitive research because we're still in that informing and generative stage of research. And then as we get into more design and detailed design and prototyping, we have the opportunity to do more evaluative or usability testing research. And then again, as we do some of the detailed design, there may be a need, and in this case, you can see that we decided maybe we would do a card sort or more usability testing as we built out those specific workflows. So for this particular project, and something that we typically do when we're doing more evaluative research or interviews, is we use these 5 tools, if you will, to make our process go smoother. So we have the protocol, and I'll talk about each of those, which is really your moderator guide. We have a guide for observers because, as I mentioned, we do invite clients to observe and participate. The post-testing debrief, the quote report, and then a refactoring sprint. So the research protocol, this isn't the detailed moderator guide, but it's the first thing that we'll create. And this is usually collaborative between the researcher, designer, and developer. And this includes the goals of the study. So what are the things that we want to learn about or understand? And then in this example, we're talking about usability testing. So what are the key tasks that we're thinking we're going to have the user go through? And this is kind of just a rough outline of what we're going to be doing in the testing. And this is something that's really great to develop immediately, maybe a week before you're planning on testing. And this is what you're going to use with design and development so that design can ensure that they have the detailed workflow designs, and then development has them built into a prototype if you're using a prototype. An observation guide, as I mentioned, we invite clients to observe, in this example, usability testing. So we just want to keep them focused on what are the actual things that we're testing, because people can have a tendency, they're particularly interested in one thing, and things can go off the rails, because if you didn't write your protocol and guide to specifically test or evaluate something, and as a result of kind of the workflows that you've designed in your test, they might observe something that wasn't actually something that we intended on testing. So it wouldn't be something that's valid in terms of a finding. So you want to be sure everyone's focused on what we are actually testing. The post-testing debrief. So this is usually the day after usability testing. The group comes together. So this is the project team and the clients who were there observing the testing, or it could be interviews. And you go back to that protocol, that kind of that handout that you designed earlier that has an outline of the test plan, so that you are focused on the key tasks and the goals of the study again, to keep everybody grounded in what we really evaluated. Hand that out to everyone, and then we'll do kind of a whiteboarding or post-it work session. And we have 4 different categories: what worked but needs tweaks, what didn't work, and then another area for things that actually require more thorough data analysis. There's not a clear observation just based on what we saw the day before. Coming out of that working session, it's your job as the researcher or Scrum Master or Product Manager to create really a high-level quote report. And again, this just reiterates what we talked about in that post-testing debrief. What were the goals? What worked? What didn't work? What needs to be tweaked? And anything else that might have come up or that you've been able to determine, in the 24 hours that passed since the testing. So this is something that will help the design and development team quickly take action based on what we saw in testing. So we're not holding up the team for a sprint or several weeks while we do a detailed report, which takes us to the next thing, which is the refactoring sprint. So this can start the day after that post-testing debrief, or coming right out of that meeting. You will have some directional findings that design and development can both start iterating on, which is how we do it. Also during the refactoring sprint, so the team has some directional insights. They move forward with their tasks for the sprint, and then you as the researcher can do your detailed analysis and kind of that detailed research findings report. And this gives you the opportunity to, one, do the thorough analysis, because you may identify other insights that weren't obvious just based on observation, and to document the actual recommendations and findings, because you may want to revisit them at a later time. And that came up on this actual project where several months after we delivered and the project was ended, the client reached out to me directly and asked something about the account login feature. And why did we make a specific decision? And some of the team back at the client's location was not clear on it and was questioning that decision. And we were actually able to just pull that report back up and see why exactly the decision was made, and that resolved the issue right away. So just to review what that kind of looks like, you can see here, this was an sprint project, and each sprint is about 3 weeks long. And we have 2 lines here for research, just to point out that we did 2 different types of research in this project. We have the top line, which was our informing research to generate new ideas, and then the evaluative to test those ideas throughout the process. And then design and development also has their own tasks. So in the first sprint, Sprint 0, we did some interviews, and design also participated a little bit in listening in on those interviews, and then we would regroup immediately after to see what kind of themes and insights we were discovering through those interviews. And then development also started doing some of their work.
Right, so we would be able to start talking with the IT team, with the client, as far as things about their platform, talk about APIs, data contracts, security, code repo, all the sorts of housekeeping that has to happen in the beginning of a project. We could get ourselves ready for that while other things were going on.
So as we move further into the first sprint, and this can even start before the kickoff of the meeting, we have some insights that are actionable for design. So they could start concepting what that framework might be, which is exactly how we did it in that project. So then as we continued on with this project into the first and second sprint, we needed to help generate more ideas with the design team. So we decided to do a competitive assessment. This wasn't something that was scoped into the project at all. It just came up. For example, there was one instance where the team was thinking about how to present a global brand in the context of a local brand website. So the US website, while there's this other global website. So we wanted to look at what their competitors were doing and if they had approached this problem in any particular way. So I went off and spent just a few hours doing some research on that particular issue, and then took some screenshots and shared those right back with the design team. So it doesn't have to be something that was planned in the beginning. If a need comes up and you're available, you can just do ad hoc research and just share those insights directly with the design team, excuse me. So then as the design team was building out the framework, the development team started to build the actual prototype, which was what we delivered in the end of the project. So they were working hand in hand with design to prototype out these design elements. And that helped me because I was able to do usability testing using a working prototype during the second sprint. So that was just a couple examples of the first couple of sprints that we looked at. But when we look at the full 8 weeks, or 8 sprint and 24-week project, we did a lot of different research. So we did stakeholder interviews, user interviews. We did different kinds of competitive assessment as we were designing and developing specific features. We did a card sort to help validate the information architecture that the content and design team was proposing. We actually did a survey on a particular set of content that the client kind of reached out and said, hey, we're thinking about this kind of content for our new brand. We have 2 versions. Can you help us figure out which one is the right one? And then we did 3 rounds of usability testing to validate the designs that had been created. There were a couple of things that we learned in this process. Well, many things, but I'm going to point out just a few of them. So the role of the researcher is really important, and that is that you really need to lead the process. So here at Intuitive, we don't have product owners, and at this point on this project, I hadn't understood that that could kind of be my role, because I'm starting in the beginning to establish the vision for this website. I'm kind of the keeper and holder of that vision. So I need to be there and keep everyone, our team and client team, focused on what that is and leading that process. So the second thing here is, what are we changing? And that refers to kind of the post-testing debrief and things that are actionable coming out of research. So it's your job as the researcher to own that discussion. So when you have that meeting, you have to be a really strong facilitator and not let anyone take over and kind of steer the direction based on what they saw or what they thought or what was important to them. You have to keep them focused on what you actually researched and how you designed that research. One example in this particular project, someone was really curious about the navigation, and we didn't test the navigation in that particular set of research. So things happened as a result of the way that we designed task 1, task 2, task 3, the workflow, and unintentionally the navigation became a topic in the post-testing debrief, but we didn't actually test it. It wasn't designed that way. And I didn't take control of that conversation or lead that discussion in the way that I needed to. So it kind of derailed things from there, and we ended up changing the navigation even though we had no data to support that decision. And then what does it mean to be agile? This can be a little bit painful until you adjust to it, but it means you need to be ready for change. And like I said, we can be working up to the day before testing on design and development, and that means that things might change last minute. So in the example that I just walked through for that particular project, during one of those usability testing sprints, the design team was making some changes to the design the night before testing. So that meant that we had to change our prototype a little bit, so that impacted development. And then very early the next morning, I had to change my protocol because the designs that I thought we were testing had changed. So I had to kind of change that up a little bit. So you have to be prepared and ready to change at a moment's notice. And that kind of leads to some of the challenges with this process. It relies on close physical proximity of teams. So because I sat right next to the designer and the developer actually sat right behind me, when these changes occurred so fast, we could communicate very easily and just turn around and tell the other person, hey, I'm thinking about changing this. This is going to impact what you're working on. I think it would be a better design, and we can come to agreement really quickly, and we're all on the same page. So that's nice as we sit next to each other, but that's not necessarily feasible for larger teams and teams that are not co-located in the same office. It also assumes and relies on hyper-communicative team members. Some people don't want to work in that way where you're discussing and working and collaborating on the same thing at the same time. You kind of want to go away and do your work. So it doesn't suit everyone's needs. And then, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily scalable to larger working teams that might be much bigger than the 50-some people that work here, or you may be in very different locations around the globe. So we see an opportunity there to improve that process, which brings us to the last part of our talk today.
The future. So how we want to frame this is that this is a change in mindset. And I talked about earlier in this the fact that we saw a linear process as being somewhat of a limitation on what we were doing. We didn't like the fact that everything was in a silo. That's how it was in the past. We've iterated upon that, and now we have multiple parallel streams. But it still is just, instead of one linear stream, we have now multiple linear streams. So not only do we iterate on products, we also iterate on the process itself. And that leads us into the topic of object-oriented UX and the role that we believe that that can play in an organization such as ours that is no longer just a small boutique design shop, but part of a larger international community. This idea I had of incorporating object-oriented thinking, the thinking of programmers into the design process, into user-centered design, as I stated, started back about 8 years ago or so. At first, it was a little bit of a slow sell for a couple of reasons. One, because no one else that I knew of at the time was really talking about it or thinking about it, even though in some ways I find when I talk to programmers, it seems somewhat intuitive to do it. And also, I was kind of lacking a specific methodology on how to apply object-oriented thinking to the design system. So when we first started, George and I collaborating on this, I'm talking about Agile and research and improving the overall user-centered design process. I came across a book written by a fellow named Dave Collins all the way back in the mid-1990s, called Designing Object-Oriented User Interface. It's about a 400-page text which goes into great detail the psychology and all the reasoning as to why and how exactly object-oriented thinking can be applied to design, to interfaces. Also, Sophia Wojciechowski, who is active, has written a number of articles on a list apart on the subject of object-oriented UX, and has contributed an object mapping exercise that I'll talk about here to the whole system of thought. So object-oriented UX is a couple of core principles to keep in mind. First is we're going to place the object design before interaction design. So we're going to think about things in terms of things rather than workflows. We're going to think about things in terms of data before logic. So if you're familiar with model-driven design, this might make some sense, but we're not going to have nearly as many constraints or straitjackets that model-driven design offers. And also, just in general, we want to abandon the assembly line microprocess where we go from phase to phase. We want to think about this much more collaboratively. We don't just want to say collaboration. We don't want to advocate for it. We actually want to do it. We want to investigate better ways of doing that and how to incentivize it and think about how this system that we're putting together can make us do that. So to repeat, we're abandoning the procedural, and then we are going to apply the object-oriented. Now, why do we want to do this specifically? Well, we want to think about it, the system, in terms of real-world conceptions of how the world works. From psychology, we know that people think about things. People don't necessarily think about workflows. If you just think about your own activity, you don't go to a website because you want to search or filter or check out. You go to a website because you want a plane ticket. Maybe even like an abstract thing like a relationship, but it's still a specific thing. You want food, you want books, we want stuff. And that's because that's how our mind is wired. You're thinking you're so invested in Agile. Well, you are, and so are we, and we have zero plans of abandoning it. We have software invested, we have teams that have worked with it, we have all sorts of workflows. You know, we don't want to throw this all at the door. We don't want to incorporate things like UML or require people to learn new programming languages. Really, this is literally just a reframing of how we're thinking about things. And in a lot of ways, it's about making a conscious decision to invest the time and the energy into creating a mental model that can be shared between all the disciplines. So rather than that linear process that we keep talking about, we're thinking about something that instead of working from left to right or from top to bottom, it's from the center out. So as you start in the beginning with the kernel of an idea, you then build it out and it gains fidelity as the process advances. So what does this look like? How do you walk through this? This all sounds like really nice abstractions and language, but how does this really play out? And let's say a use case where you're trying to develop a minimal viable product. What you're going to do is start off with a discrete object which can have associated actions and adjectives associated with it. So for the programmers out there, you probably get the idea that a noun is an object and that an action is a method and an adjective is a property. For those of you who are not programmers, you probably understand grammar. So let's just think about a fictional website called coinrater.com where people can rate coins and their quality. So in that case, you have a coin, which is your object, and you're going to do things like rate it, and you're going to have various adjectives, various properties, such as year for a coin. So in this fictional website that we're talking about, in this particular website, people will upload pictures of coins. I don't know if there's any coin collectors in the audience, but as you might know, it costs some money to get these appraised, and if you're just an amateur collector who likes the history and the art and that type of thing, it can be really prohibitively expensive to get professional appraisers to put a value on a coin. So let's just imagine that you're a coin collecting enthusiast, you're an amateur, and you want to upload pictures of coins so that you can draw on the wisdom of crowds and try to get like an aggregate idea of what the value of your coin is. And also secondarily, you can have like a nice catalog because, you know, if you're a coin collector, that's what you like to do. You like to collect coins and you like to put them in taxonomies and organize them, and it's just, you know, it's what people do when they collect coins. So in this particular example, we have a couple of different user stories associated with this fictional website. So as a user, I can view numerous coins so that I can rate each coin. So that's a particular workflow. And that's a workflow that relates to coins and rating and views. Another workflow, another user story is as a user, I can add, edit, delete comments for each coin and sort by date posted. Another one is, as a user, I can view the properties of each coin so that I can see what the current average rating is, as well as view the year, mint, type, obverse and reverse image, and see who the user is who originally uploaded the coin, because maybe after you're done with the MVP, you might have some sort of social media aspect. Maybe it's a community of coin collectors so people can meet up and swap and trade and barter and all that type of thing. Now you can see here in this object mapping exercise that we have color-coded some things. We've taken and isolated the nouns. We've made those blue. Those nouns can also be thought of as objects. We've also taken verbs, made those green, and those verbs are methods in programmer speak. Then we have adjectives, which are properties, and those are yellow. And then we have metadata, which is collection of various properties, so something like current average rating. Now you can take this even further. So imagine if you had your researchers, your designers, and your developers all in the same room. You isolated a handful of these objects from your MVP. You could take stickies. So imagine you had blue stickies, green, yellow, purple. So then you could then isolate all these things. And now all of a sudden you have what is the beginning of a class diagram where you've got a coin object, a comment object, and a user object. And the coin has associated properties and associated methods and various aggregate properties. When you start walking through this and developing this, you can now start to get a sense for the scope of a project. You can also enforce greater degrees of collaboration, because now suddenly programmers are going to start thinking about, geez, is this a one-to-one relationship, or is this a one-to-many or many-to-many? And the designers can start thinking about workflows, so they can actually start thinking about those interactions. So instead of having to rate a coin using 3 clicks, how could they do it with 1, make it much more intuitive? Also, the PM can be involved, researcher, so you can get all these little stories kind of worked out in the beginning. In the past, this doesn't even necessarily need to be an MVP or something as large as a project. It could be just a simple component. In the past, I've worked where a user story would come in, a designer would then spend a week developing a component, iterating, going back and forth with the client. And then the following Monday, it would come to us. We'd have to look at it, sort of intuitively start to understand what it is, maybe talk to the client about data contracts. Well, if we did this on the first day, on Monday morning, where we had the designer and we had the developer sit down, just map this out, then instead of having 1 week followed by a second week, you can have 2 parallel development efforts going at the same time. So you're looking at a very big possible increase in speed of development there. Another example is, so let's think about workflows. A researcher is planning usability testing, and he gives a developer a list of workflows to build into a prototype. So you have flow 1, where you have a page and an action described. It's pretty vague. The developer looks at it and realizes, well, I haven't been in the research meetings. I haven't been talking to designers. I don't know what the heck any of this means. They're going to start to see problems with this. There's vaguely defined pages to reflect on the researcher's mental model of it, not designer dev. So the language that the research department has might be a completely different reflection of a model that is completely different than the model that the developers are going to develop, and the developers are going to have a model which is a consequence of the whisper down the lane problem, where it's going to be different and it's going to probably miss various details along the way. There's sentence fragments instead of user stories. There's no clear delineation between page and action or relationship between them. There's no URLs reference, which can be confusing for developers who may have just come into the project or don't have a lot of experience with it. So if we reframe it as an object-oriented UX exercise, we could take, instead of an object model, we could take this workflow and we can add some color coding to it also. So researchers planning usability testing, and then we can have it all like this, where we've got an object state with a code associated with it, F1.1, F1.2, and so forth. And then, so those object states would all relate and be a child of workflow 1, where you'd have specific pages, which would be a state of a collection of objects, and then also an action, some sort of CTA, which is green. And that blue and that green sort of relate to the previous object model exercise, where the objects were blue and the CTAs were green. Then we can also have a colloquial name that we can all agree upon, such as start or account entry. And most importantly, a URL, because sometimes the wrong thing can be tested, or this might require more communication. You have to bother someone who might be in the middle of something, or wait an hour to get an answer. So if this is just all set up front, where you have this OUX mindset with workflows as thinking and conceived as object states, you can get a lot more accuracy, cut down on unnecessary communication and confusion, and importantly, have that shared mental model. Because how many times have you been in a meeting where the designer and the developer and the client were all calling the same thing, different names? And that is quite embarrassing, and that is a consequence of not having a shared mental model, and that is a consequence of not making the conscious decision to generate collaboratively that mental model. So the effect of OOUX on process, it is instead of research, then design, then development, it is the decision to have research and design and development all working together. And rather than passing a potato from one person to another, it is all about keeping the user at the center of that design process. And instead of thinking of it as a left to right thing, think of it as a center out, where each additional ring is an additional level of fidelity that can be added and additional depth to a product that you're building. Again, we're going to speak all the same language with the user and the objects and the collection of objects and their state in the center. And that is where we would like to take the future of this. So we have some things planned that we're doing internally. I've written some articles about this. I'll be writing more in the future. And we're actually working these exercises into a design thinking workshop within the next couple of weeks. I'll be writing about those as well in the future. So for the rest of the year, we're going to be generating more content and hopefully some white papers and case studies on our experience with this. So we're looking to solicit ideas from other people who might have really great ways, for example, how to better visually illustrate object states and workflows. Also think about what sort of role research and design may play in defining those objects, what some of the stumbling blocks are. This is a very intuitive process for developers. They immediately get it. Researchers seem to have a good, an easy way of understanding. I personally have not really found the perfect way to explain this to designers. Sometimes it takes a little bit more time. So we're looking for ways to talk to other designers about what they understand or don't understand and how we might be able to represent this better. And also thinking about what other challenges do we need to solve for? What have we thought about? What sort of impediments might we reach when we work on this in the real world? So that pretty much wraps it up. We're both on LinkedIn if you want to reach out to us. We both have Twitters. So if you want to get in touch with us and talk about this, that's great. But right now, we're prepared to take some questions for a couple minutes.
Great job, Georgia and Ed. We have some great questions here that we will dive into actually right now. And while we dive into the questions, I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll here for people. All this information helps us make sure that the webinars we run in the future are tailored to everyone's interests. And of course, I will again post the link to our Slack team, which is open to people who have more than 3 years of experience in a product team. So right now we have about 3,200 designers, developers, and product managers in this Slack team, which is Product Tribes. I just posted the link there. Yeah, let's go ahead and dive into some questions. So first question we have is about how and where did you recruit your test subjects in that particular case study that you were describing?
Sure. So it was actually a mix. Our client was able to provide us some users for the usability testing. For the initial interviews as well as the survey, we used a recruitment vendor, and that's where you have to do planning a few weeks in advance because they typically need 2 weeks to do their recruitment. But for our part, that's about 3 hours to write the screener, and then you hand that off to the vendor, and then you're kind of waiting for them to fill your recruitment.
Gotcha.
If you need examples of vendors, just let me know.
Gotcha. And to get an idea of the team size, Hugo here is curious for the website redesign project that you were talking about. how many team members were involved in that entire process?
Give me one moment. Our core team is actually 7 people. So it's 2 designers, 2 developers, a content strategist, a researcher, and an engagement person. So we keep our team pretty slim.
Gotcha. And the next question is about how research gets initiated. So at Intuitive, is a good percentage of research happening sort of proactive, or does it happen upon a client request, for instance, like as a requirement of a project?
Okay. Well, historically, our clients have come to us because they understand our user-centered design approach and that we have dedicated researchers. So that is an advantage that we have in Intuitive. But that's not to say that our research is typically something that the client requests. It's because the researcher, or if you're a UX person that's doing the research, is engaged throughout the project, they're there to identify needs as they come up. So if you hear a question from a client or your project team that needs to be answered, that's kind of a cue to you that you might want to do some quick research. If you're doing design or development, you know that you're going to want to test those. So that's kind of an easy one.
Got it. And the next question is actually about object-oriented UX. And this person is curious if you see any similarities between object-oriented UX and Brad Frost's atomic design approach.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that. In one respect, they're a little bit different because Brad Frost's approach is more of a design system, whereas this is a bit of a methodology, but within his system, he conceives of things as objects. So there is a lot similar there in that there's a very conscious construction of a mental model. And actually, I discovered Brad Frost's system later on, and that has sort of inspired us here to do our own work on a design system. So we'll be actually releasing a design system formally in May. So it's somewhat influenced by Brad, but also by a number of other design systems that are out there. And as I mentioned that we're going to be rolling this object-oriented UX out into some upcoming projects. We're going to be doing some design thinking exercises. And we're going to be using our design system and also object-oriented UX. So they're a little bit different, but they're definitely related, and they're going to intersect a lot. And our design system is probably, in a lot of ways, going to be influenced by this. So these are all very related topics with a lot of overlap.
Gotcha. And in terms of object-oriented UX, how early and after how many iterations do your designers generally present the object-oriented UX documentation, start talking with developers around the implementation?
Well, the idea is that we would all do this at once. In an ideal state, you would create that object model and you would have an agreement upon it. And it doesn't really need to be complicated. Just like I said with the stickies, you take a picture of it, and at that point, that's your documentation. In an ideal state, at that point, the developers could go off and start developing an API. They could use behavior-driven development. They can write unit tests. If they know what those objects are, what the relationships are, what the construction is, they should ideally be able to work on that without even having to see wireframes. But now, typically, the situation is wireframes get developed, followed by design, followed by getting handed off. So in an ideal state, both these things will be working on at the same time, so we can reduce all that lag.
Got it. And in the design team at Intuitive, how many development teams do you interface with? Is it is it kind of like a centralized model of designers working on multiple projects and then interfacing with a lot of different teams there, or is it more of an embedded approach?
We typically have small project teams that are dedicated to a particular project. So a couple of designers and a couple of developers are typically on one project, sometimes two, depending on how much of a need there is to have those resources on the projects. And then researchers are dedicated to multiple projects. So for example, right now I'm dedicated to 3 different projects because they don't need 100% of my time. So I attend a subset of the meeting. So I don't attend the daily scrums. I'll attend 1 to 2 per week. I'll attend planning and demos and maybe 1 client meeting per week per client. So then I can be engaged enough to be able to identify if there's a research opportunity.
Gotcha. And the next question we have here is, let's see here. So how do you adapt user research to different sprint lengths? So for instance, if you're working in a 3-week or even a 2-week sprint instead of a 1-week sprint, what do you generally do to still make sure that research can fit into that workflow?
So we try to think about that in that initial sprint kind of planning road mapping meeting that we have in the very beginning of a project. So for example, if it's a 2-week sprint based project, I know that if we're going to be doing usability testing specifically, I'm going to need to be engaged for about 3 weeks. Now that really only means 4 to 5 days of my time, but I know I'm going to have to get started a week to 2 weeks before we're actually going to do the usability testing. So I'm planning alongside of the rest of the team, but not necessarily beholden to the deadlines of their sprints. So if I know they're going to be delivering something at the end of a sprint that I'm going to want to test in the very beginning of the next sprint, I want to start that maybe 2 weeks in advance. So it's just trying to identify in the beginning where you think those research opportunities are going to be, and then by staying engaged throughout the project, if that's realistic, if you're really thinking you're going to be on that timeline and there is an opportunity to do bigger research like usability testing, you're going to want to have to plan for that in advance.
Right.
For the other things, like I mentioned, competitive analysis or just ad hoc research as questions come up, I'll just do it obviously in the context of that sprint as soon as possible. That could be same day. If I'm already resourced that day, the next day, it could be several days later, but within the context of that sprint so that they can still deliver on time.
So generally, do you find that it's better to have the research be a couple sprints ahead of the actual design and development, or does it happen in a much tighter proximity?
It is slightly in advance of design and development, and that does work best. So we definitely do try to do that. However, that's not always feasible. So with usability testing, we try to plan ahead of time, but we don't know exactly when that's going to occur. So it just depends. It is best if we're doing informing research, so coming up with ideas and generating ideas, that you do that a sprint ahead of design so that you have those insights and ideas ready for them when they get started on that particular feature set.
Got it. And another person here says that very often product managers are looking at how developers can execute their ideas. So have you found any particular effective methods of communicating the value of user research, especially within an agile process?
Oh, that's a great question. And unfortunately, that is a lot of researchers and UX designers' time, is trying to explain the process and the value of it. I think it's something that's more of an organizational challenge. It's hard to change a particular person's mind, and if they're not bought into that being the process, I think you're going to see challenges throughout your working life there. There's a lot of strategies online. I can't think of anything in particular that works well, other than the best strategy that we employ is inviting those people to observe and participate in the research, so they're bought into the project process. So if they have the product manager has an idea, okay, great, let's test that. Let's see users try that out or what their reaction to that is. And then definitely invite those people, clients or product managers, to observe and hear firsthand what your actual users or other people, how they react to that particular idea. Reporting back is not as effective as seeing it firsthand.
Right. And this question is more about evaluating the type of research that's required. So from your experience, how do you generally go about determining whether you need to conduct, informing research or evaluating research? So sort of generative versus more sort of refined research.
Sure. So it just, you have to isolate what the research question is. Are we trying to generate a new idea about something, or are we trying to validate an idea? So if you're looking for insights on how to design something, then you're going to do generative research. And you have a couple of different methods like interviews or competitive assessment in your toolbox that you'll typically go to. Or if you're validating ideas, it could be usability testing or even a UX assessment could be used for either. So you have to be very specific about your research question and then go to the methods that you would apply for that. A good book that I could recommend is Just Enough Research by Erica Hall. I frequently revisit that book when I know what my question is, or even how to identify the question, and then she gives you kind of an overview of what kind of research should apply there and how to do it quickly.
Got it. And on that note, I think we will close out the session since the hour has passed. Thank you, George and Ed, for sharing your insights. This was fantastic. And thank you to everybody here who joined us for the session.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you everyone for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And on May 10th, our last session in the UX and Development at Scale Masterclass will happen at May 10th, 10 a.m., where UXPin CEO Martin will be talking a bit about how he helped to create our design system and the lessons that he's learned along the way. So it'll be a pretty detailed case study of what worked and what didn't work. So yeah, hopefully we'll see everybody here at that session as well. With that being said, yeah, everybody, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you in the future. And take care, Ed and Georgia.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.